Well, that's me, Eugene Jarecki. I made the segment It's Not Always a Wonderful Life, which is based on the segment of the book, FREAKONOMICS, that's about an unusual connection that Levin and Dubner traced between crime rates in America and abortion, two very controversial subjects that we tried to tackle and tried to present as sensitively as we could.
When I started studying crime in the early 1990s, it was roughly at its peak, the highest it had ever been in the United States. And all the experts expected it would go higher and higher. The warnings were everywhere. But then, much to everyone's surprise, something happened.
People have accused me of trying to make every single piece of work that I do in some way a reference to Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life. I'm probably guilty of that. I love Frank Capra, and as you can see on these TV screens, I decided to set my segment against the story of It's a Wonderful Life, because after all, It's a Wonderful Life in a weird way is about the same kind of existential questions that the chapter on abortion and crime is about. Basically, George Bailey in that movie It's a Wonderful Life is asked to contemplate what the world would look like if he had never been born. And so it was interesting to me that the abortion chapter of FREAKONOMICS really asks, what does the world look like when a child is either forced to be born because abortion is illegal, or is allowed to be not born, aborted, and therefore not experience the life of being unwanted, which is what ultimately my segment, It's Not Always a Wonderful Life, is about. It's about the connection between unwantedness as a social phenomenon and crime, and the fact that there is a link between the two.
That the crime wave of the preceding decade would continue to rise. It would be the decade of the mega criminal.
As you see here, it's animated, and these cartoon figures, to some degree, I guess we were thinking about the way people watch video games. A guy can point a gun at you in a video game, and a person can die or be aborted in a video cartoon exercise, and you don't feel as sensitive emotionally about it. There isn't as much supercharged emotion as there would be if this were live action. So there was a big part of me that knew the abortion crime segment of the book was highly controversial when the book came out, and if I was going to put it on screen, it wouldn't have sort of the protective veil of the printed word to stand behind. It was all of a sudden going to be live action or, something on screen proposing the idea that crime goes down when abortion is made legal. That's a very sensitive argument for obviously a lot of people who care deeply about both crime and abortion as national issues. So by animating it, by putting it in this cartoon universe, I thought it would welcome a lot of people in to be able to think about it without excessive sensitivity. It could be a bit more of an academic question for all of us to think about.
Separate the more likely factors from the less likely ones. The crime drop explanation most often cited was that innovative policing strategies had been introduced in some cities.
As you can hear, the narrator is Melvin Van Peebles, who's a man I've admired for much of my life. I think any independent filmmaker admires Melvin Van Peebles. He's really, in many ways, the godfather of so much of independent cinema. But he also has a voice that brings to the mind a sort of a deeper, wiser, struggle side look at the American story, unlike the usual narrator who usually sounds like they have a very thick British accent, or they have some generic accent that's been focus group tested to not offend, quote, right-thinking everyday people. And I wanted to have a voice that spoke from a different place, so that part of what I think Levin and Dubner bring to bear in this piece is a very unexpected argument.
That it really was the policing strategies.
The second reason most cited for the crime drop was an increase in the reliance on prisons.
And as you can hear from Melvin Van Peebles' voice, he does not have a very typical white-bread generic narrator voice. He's more of a voice that speaks to the kind of counterintuitive wisdom that I think the chapter is about.
That imprisoning more people will, in the short term, bring crime rates down.
Animating sections like this was hard for me. I mean, these are images that border on images of totalitarian regimes that imprison people in mass numbers. And I think, in America, we do imprison people in mass numbers for lots of things. The leader is, of course, the drug war. And that's one of the arguments that was made in the chapter, is that people at the time when crime dropped in the 90s said, well, it's all about drugs. It was all about drugs when the crime drop went up, and now the crack market has changed, and so it went down. This is one of the arguments that Levin and Dubner look at is, was it really really just changes in the crack market that caused the crime drop. And they say, well, that had some part of it. I think one of the things that's good about their argument is they always give a little bit of credit where it's due. If they think that, the crack market had some role in it, they're going to say, yeah, they say here, it had about 15% of the crime drop might be accountable to that. But what you start to see in the later parts of this chart is that the other reasons that were given, gun control, that gun control laws, helped, or that a strong economy helped, or that more police helped, all that together didn't really have that much of an impact. And they end up, as we are about to see from this graphic, which we tried to sort of bring to life for people, really saying all the reasons that people gave at the time for the crime drop in the 1990s, if you take all of those together, they really only add up to about half of the crime drop. The other half, as Melvin Van Peebles about to say, it was a mystery. It was unsolved why the other half of the crime drop had happened.
Let's rewind to what for many Americans may have seemed an irrelevant incident in a faraway place.
Now, this is where the film takes a turn. It goes from being my little It's a Wonderful Life cartoon parable to what looks like an old Eastern European propaganda film. But it's an amazing leap that Levitt and Dubner make in their chapter, where basically when they were looking for what could the possible reasons have been to account for a crime drop, what were we not thinking of? What were Giuliani and others not saying was the reason for the crime drop, because they were taking credit for it as if it was just tough on crime had done its job. And what they found was that something had happened in Romania that was very interesting in thinking about the American condition, which was that in Romania, when Ceausescu came to power as a dictator, he had made abortion illegal. And about 18 years later, lo and behold, crime and poor job performance and poor education performance shot up, skyrocketed. And the question was, well, maybe the reverse had been true in America. In other words, and this is where the piece takes its turn toward the real most substantive claim by Levitt and Dubner. I mean, was it perhaps actually that America experienced the opposite, that America, when Roe v. Wade legalized abortion, would it have been the case that 18 years later, the opposite of Romania, we might have seen that crime dropped, so that abortion, which made wantedness rise and unwantedness decrease, might have made it so that those lives that would have been unwanted simply never happened because the children had never been born.
You've been given a great gift, George. A chance to see what the world would be like without you.
As Clarence just said, you're getting a chance to see what the world would look like without you. So what we're getting to see in this piece is, what does America look like when pro-abortion legislation made it possible for wantedness to increase and unwantedness to decrease, and therefore all of the social blight that come along with that. The idea that unwantedness produces lives that are less rewarding, that have less of a sense of purpose, have less nurturing, have less guidance. And therefore there sort of stands to reason, you would think, that a life that's unwanted might lead more likely to crime. And so one of the questions that Levitt and Dubner try to prove is there a connection? I mean, this is the point of the whole section. Is there a connection between unwantedness ultimately and crime? And they, in their own work, they refer to studies that were done in other countries, for example, that do show a very direct connection between unwantedness and crime.
They simply weren't there to do the crime.
You see, George, you really had a wonderful life. Don't you see what a mistake it would be to throw it away?
And again, I always wanted to set this against the sort of utopian America that I see in these Frank Capra movies, because there's something always I find very poignant when I drive across this country and I am filming a movie in this place or that place, just seeing, how far America has in many ways drifted from the ideals that I see on screen here. It's enough to get you really choked up, and that's one of the things that's at stake here. I mean, people can have very strong feelings about abortion from a religious perspective. People can have very strong feelings about crime from a personal safety perspective, or the world they wish they lived in. But they also have to recognize that we are living in a country that was supposed to be a real symbol of democratic virtues, of virtues about protecting the individual and caring about their fate and collective activity, community, all of us caring about each other. And so when I hear the argument that, in fact, a sensitive issue like abortion can actually have this sort of unexpected connection to an issue like crime, I think it's very important for people to think about, because it makes it harder to just have a simplistic view one way or another, either pro or anti. Now you're looking at a different side of it, a side you might not have expected, where you're seeing, okay, what if it is the case? Take someone who is very pro-life. They may be saying, well, my religious views are so pro-life that I am, and I'm very focused on, therefore, not wanting people to be aborting pregnancies. And that's a position that many people have and that they have every right to feel very strongly about. At the same time, they would have to recognize that what might come with that is that they then are compelling the births of people who will be unwanted. And if they themselves are interested in family values, they are probably working at cross purposes to their own goals. So that there's an internal contradiction in some sense that I think Levin and Dubner have highlighted for people to think about. There's an internal contradiction between being pro-life on the one hand and then wanting to see intact and robust family values for the society on the other. And that brings you into this sort of dark tunnel of trying to figure out, well, how do you reconcile those things? And what if you had to choose? What if you're somebody who is very pro-life, but is also very focused on family values and, for example, doesn't want a lot of people leaning heavily on the social safety net? Well, if you compel women to give birth, it does stand to reason, and it's worth considering, that what will come from that may be unwantedness that leads to lives that are unproductive, potentially criminal, and you will find more people, most likely, leaning on the same social safety net you don't want them leaning on. And so you may, in fact, as someone who is in favor of, or somebody who is opposed to abortion, you may find yourself working at cross purposes to another part of your sort of desired policy slate. I think that's what's probably most provocative about what Levin and Dubner have proposed here. And in bringing it to screen, my goal is to invite as many people to think about that as possible, because you can't always have everything. And I think very often in public policy matters, you do have to choose your priorities. And I think one of the things that Levin and Dubner are good at is making people question their preconceived sort of calcified postures and making those loosen up. And it was my hope to at least be able to help encourage that kind of dialogue.
Reduction in crime.
Hey! Kids, Janie, Tommy.
And of course, if I start something on It's a Wonderful Life, I suppose I have to end it there, because I think all things begin and end with it being a Frank Capra movie in the end. So we can all hope it will be. And I guess that hope is embodied in the framing of the piece.